The first thing that hit me wasn't the diamond. It was the way my daughter's voice rushed through the phone, as if joy itself had a deadline. The screen cut a harsh rectangle of light across my living room, and there was Eva in a city of glass. San Francisco glittering behind her like a promise she hadn't read the fine print on, breathless, laughing, thrusting a hand at the camera so the stone could burst into little rainbows on my old man's eyes. Then a face slid into frame, tall, handsome, hair so perfectly placed it looked terraced, and he said my name with the easy confidence of men who've practiced sounding sincere. Mr. Rice. And I said, "It's Giles." And he nodded like a king, remembering a peasant's nickname. Harold Kensington, cryptocurrency entrepreneur, early investor, diversified, hedged. The kind of bio that unspools like expensive silk until you touch it and discover it's polyester. And while Eva talked flowers and dates, March already? He kept a calm palm on her shoulder, thumb tracing neat, proprietary loops, eyes drifting just off screen, as if there were a second audience I couldn't see. I asked polite questions a father asks when the wedding arrives before the season does. He answered like a man who advertises stability for a living. And when the call ended, my apartment folded back into its old winter quiet, steam curling from the mug I'd forgotten to sip, the paper slumped on the arm of the chair. I told myself I was only rattled because it was fast and because I missed Margaret, the one who would have watched 3 minutes of that video and asked for the last name twice. But there was something else. The ring too big for 2 months. The address that looked like rent was a trophy. The watch posed to catch light, as if every glint were an argument. I stood, stretched the ache from a back that knows closing costs and clean exits. And before I could sit again, the screen brightened with a text from Eva. Links to the venue, the Fairmont, and a photo of them under a chandelier the size of a Buick. "Isn't it perfect, Dad?" And I typed, "Beautiful," because when your child sings, you don't argue with the melody. That night, the cold worked the windows, and the old radiator hummed like a tired animal. And I tried to write what I felt in the leather journal Margaret gave me, a habit I've never kept. But all that came were small sentences that looked like warnings written by a man who hates being right. I slept badly and woke worse, and at dawn, I found myself rewatching the call in my head. Small frames you can only see if you slow life to the speed of doubt. His smile tightening when I asked about timing. The soft pivot to talk of opportunities. The way he said my surname like he was tasting it for collateral. I told myself I was being unfair. That love sometimes moves faster than paperwork, and still the room felt a size too small. I made eggs, left them untouched, opened the blinds, and the city outside did what cities do. It kept going, with or without my blessing. Later, when Eva called back to gush over a florist's mood board and a dress she wasn't sure she could breathe in, I caught myself counting beats before Harold cut in. Every interruption sounded like a signature. I swallowed my lecture and said what fathers say. "I'm happy if you're happy." And she said, "I knew you'd come around." Maybe I will, I thought. And maybe caution is just a story we tell ourselves to feel wise after the damage. If you're still with me, if you're the kind who listens to an old man sift meaning from little noises, do me a small kindness. Hit subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Because I've learned the hard way that the people in your corner matter when the room gets loud. I ended the day at my window, with the city hemming itself in neon and brake lights, fingers tapping a checkbook I hadn't opened in months, wondering when exactly my life had become a place where words like blockchain and bridal suite kept company, and whether a man can love his daughter fiercely enough to ask the questions she doesn't want answered. I told the dark I'd do my best. Then I told Margaret the same, and the dark, being honest for once, promised me nothing at all. 13 days later, I was stirring a coffee I didn't want in a room designed to make men like Harold feel inevitable. Marble tables, waiters who glide, the kind of Upper East Side hush that smells faintly of money and very old decisions. And there he was already seated in the corner booth, suit the color of storm glass, hair arranged like a thesis on control, standing just long enough to clasp my hand with a grip that said, "I've practiced seeming grateful." He called me Mr. Rice again, and I let him, because I wanted to hear what the performance required of him. Small pleasantries evaporated quickly, and then the pivot. "I asked you here man to man," he said, moving his cup 90 degrees as if the room should align itself, "because I refuse to disappoint Eva. The venue wants everything up front, and thanks to a temporary regulatory hold on one of my funds, I'm illiquid for a few months. Assets north of 2 million. But timing is cruel. It would be an embarrassment for her." He slid a folio across the table, documents crisply tabbed, stamped, notarized looking, a page of portfolio screenshots with the kind of numbers that hypnotize people who want to be reassured. I watched his eyes while I read, never on me, always a fraction to the left, checking a clock only he could see. And somewhere beneath the cologne and the polish, I caught the tinny smell of haste. "How much?" I asked, hearing Margaret in my head, steady as a piano teacher's metronome. "Count slowly, then decide." 50, he said, as if asking for a glass of water, "which I'll repay with interest by year's end. Please don't tell Eva. It would crush her to think I couldn't provide. Let me give her the fairy tale she deserves." He said, "Fairy tale the way salesmen say limited, like a door that would close without my signature." I held the papers longer than necessary, let the silence gather around us until it had weight. He didn't fidget so much as curate his stillness, thumb smoothing an invisible crease on the table, pinky ring turned a quarter turn toward the light. And when he finally met my eyes, there was something like challenge in the kindness. I thought of Eva at 8, reading on the floor, with Margaret's sweater wrapped around her shoulders. Of Eva at 22, crossing a stage while I clapped so hard my hands stung. I thought of the January night when her voice flooded my old living room with a future she'd already purchased in her head. My coffee went cold while I weighed the shape of the ask. Every line in me wanted to say no, to call a banker friend, to verify every stamp and seal, to stand up and leave the theater of this plea. But love is a saboteur with good intentions, and it whispers about timing and daughters and how pride shouldn't ruin a dress fitting. "If I do this," I said, choosing each word like a step on ice, "it stays between us. Ava doesn't carry this on her wedding day." Relief bloomed on his face, so fast it looked rehearsed. "You won't regret it," he said, the promise rolling off his tongue like a pebble down a polished chute. I opened my checkbook. Yes, the dinosaur, and wrote carefully, the way you write a name on a birth certificate or a headstone. His pupils widened at the sound of the paper tearing free. He reached, too quickly, then corrected to a gracious pace, tucking the check into a leather wallet that had never met a scuff. The waiter appeared as if summoned by the scent of completion, and Harold declined dessert with a magnanimous wave, stood and thanked me again, softer this time, almost intimate. You've made your daughter's dream possible, sir. He left in a flurry of purpose, phone already in hand, and I stayed, staring at the empty curve his body had warmed, at the folder I'd photographed with my eyes, but not my camera. I paid for the coffee I hadn't touched, stepped out into a bright winter that didn't care what I'd done, and walked 20 blocks without noticing a single storefront. Back in my apartment, I laid Margaret's photo beside my ledger and wrote one sentence in the journal she'd given me years ago. I have bought my child a story. Please let it be true. The radiator hissed an answer I didn't like, and somewhere beyond my windows, the city kept moving, indifferent to the small, precise sound a trap makes when it finally sets. 3 days later, I was across the continent under San Francisco's porcelain sky, pretending jet lag explained the weight behind my eyes, when Eva texted an address and a heart, and I found myself walking into quints, glass and linen and low golden light, the kind of room that flatters men like Harold. He rose in a charcoal suit cut so clean it could draw blood, took my hand with a temperature-controlled smile, and guided me to the corner table that gave him command of the room. We started with the crudo, he said, answering a question I hadn't asked, then waved down the sommelier and ordered a Montrachet with the solemnity of a baptism, narrating terroir and barrel program while keeping his arm draped along the back of Eva's chair, thumb moving in small proprietary circles. He was careful with me. Mr. Rice, you must get great Sicilian olive oil in New York? But there was a seam of mockery in the silk. Little nicks he knew would only sting later. When the menus arrived, he did not pass mine until he'd recommended what I'd probably find approachable. A phrase that landed like a hand on my head, and Eva, lit from within by a happiness she'd earned honestly, laughed and said, "Dad's more adventurous than you think," which should have helped but didn't. I tried to talk about real things, their apartment, her work, how they planned to blend calendars and stubbornness. But Harold deflected each topic with a shiny joke or a micro-lecture about volatility, like he was swapping my questions for coins from a rigged machine. The check came in a leather booklet, and he produced a black card with theatrical ease, not looking at me but making sure I looked at him. And outside on Jackson Street, he kissed Eva's forehead with the reverence of a man who has practiced reverence, then slid her into the passenger seat of his Tesla and told me he'd have everything handled by the morning. A sentence that trailed him like cologne as he pulled away. My hotel room was a tidy cube of neutrality, with a desk too small for doubt. But doubt learned to fold itself, and I opened the laptop, typed his name, added LLC, fund complaint, and watched the first page behave beautifully. LinkedIn gloss, puff interviews, a TechCrunch mention that read like advertorial, before page 3 turned and the varnish buckled. Kensington Digital Ventures, filed 6 months ago, address a UPS store on Market. A civil docket in Los Angeles, with his middle name attached to words that don't belong near a man about to join your family. Misappropriation, wire, identity, a PDF of a complaint with a woman's name I didn't know, and photographs that made my breath shorten. Harold at an engagement party that wasn't ours. Harold beside a different woman holding up a diamond that rhymed with Eva's. Harold rehearsing the same pose so perfectly you could set a metronome to it. I dug until the night went thin. Screenshots of messages promising guaranteed returns through boutique crypto plays, registrations under alternate surnames, a pattern of 6-month romances that ended right on schedule with drained accounts and deleted profiles. I printed everything the business center would spit, feed trays clattering as if the building wanted me finished, and built neat stacks named for women I'd never meet. Rebecca, Sarah, Jennifer. There were forums too, posts half scrubbed by lawyers where victims traded cautions under aliases like bruises covered by sleeves. Closest to the bone was a brief from a task force on romance investment fraud that described narcissistic grooming, accelerated commitment, financial entanglement under the banner of provision. Clinical language that still managed to sound exactly like Harold asking me for 50 under the word fairy tale. Somewhere around 4, I found a scanned notebook page in a filing. His hand, I was sure of it. That polished, forward-leaning lowercase g, listing venues, rings, vendors, a column labeled liquidity stopgaps, and beneath it, bridge gift from father, which turned my stomach in one slow motion. Dawn bled into the room, and San Francisco started its soft mechanical morning. Street sweepers and first coffees, and I laid the evidence out on the bed, like a map a man follows to a place he doesn't want to go. I thought of calling Eva right then, of letting the PDF speak where I could not, but I heard her laugh from dinner and Harold's hand on her chair, and knew he'd intercept, twist, recast my alarm as sabotage. So I wrote her a letter on hotel stationery, just the facts, no adjectives, and photographed every page, then sat with my thumb over her contact until it trembled and withdrew. I decided on sunlight, on looking my daughter in the eye, on giving truth a face instead of a subject line, and I closed the laptop on the stacks as if I could keep them from spreading, and watched the city gather itself for the day where mine had already changed. I waited for the city to wake, because I'd promised myself I would do this in daylight, with coffee and the truth between us. So at 7:12, I texted Eva to meet me at a corner cafe 2 blocks from her building. Neutral ground, bright windows, a pastry case that made people kinder. She arrived in a cream sweater and wedding planner glow, kissed my cheek, and sat with her hands wrapped around a mug, like warmth could be stored for later. And I said, as gently as I could manage, "Sweetheart, I need you to hear something hard before you say yes forever." Then slid the hotel envelope across the table. She didn't touch it at first, searched my face for the old reflex. Exaggeration, overprotective fussing. And when I didn't blink, she pulled out the first document, the Los Angeles docket, with Harold's name pinned to words no fiancé earns. Her eyes tracking line by line until they snagged on a photo of him beside another woman wearing a ring that could have been hers reflection. "Dad, this is internet slander," she said, voice too bright. "There are scams built on ruining people like him." But her fingers betrayed her, worrying the paper's edge until it furled. I told her he'd asked me, for 50,000 under the banner of frozen assets and fairy tale timelines, that I'd been ashamed to keep the secret, that I was ashamed now for how far I let it go. She pulled her hands back like my words were hot, blinked hard, and stood, already texting, already calling. I'm bringing Harold here. And in under 5 minutes, he was at our table smelling like minted aftershave and last night's confidence, putting a steadying hand on her shoulder while addressing me as if I were a disruptive investor. Mr. Rice, these documents are malicious fabrications from a civil dispute. I was exonerated, he said smoothly, and when I cited the current filing number, he pivoted, outdated, contextless, then turned to Eva with a soft, wounded innocence I recognized from my research as much as from the way she wavered. Love, he's scared of losing you. Some fathers mistake control for care. I breathed, counted to 5, and slid the page with his shell company address, the UPS store, beside the printout of a forum where victims spoke in careful pseudonyms. Then the screenshot of his notebook column labeled Bridge Gift from Father, his tidy lowercase g leaning forward like it wanted to fall into the next lie. He glanced at it once, too quickly, and went on offense, voice dropping into pity. Sir, you've been on the wrong websites. Deep fakes, coordinated harassment. Why would I risk my life with Eva for a handful of dollars? And I answered without heat. Because it's never a handful, and it's never your life at risk. And the mask flickered. He recovered with speed that would impress a stage magician, thanking me for my concern, telling Ava we should set boundaries, pivoting to logistics, florist, seating chart, vendor calls, because men who live by momentum hate stillness. Ava's gaze ping-ponged between our faces, love and doubt wrestling in eyes that had been clear since she was small. And then shame did what manipulation couldn't. She blazed, Dad, you gave him money, and now you're punishing me for it. And my mouth opened to say no, to say I was trying to pull her away from a cliff I'd already tested with my own foot. But Harold was quicker, gentling her with phrases designed to lodge like pearls. We don't let fear script our marriage, do we? And he's grieving, that's all. And to me, almost tender, please don't ruin what you can simply bless, which is the sentence that turned something in me from water to glass. I told Eva I would send everything in a single email and asked, begged, her to read it alone before she shared it, then stood because staying would concede the field to his confidence. She stood too, chin tilted in bridal defiance that wasn't hers before him, and said the words that would echo all the way to an easel at the Fairmont. Don't come to my wedding if you can't be happy for me. While he watched over her shoulder with that small private smile men like him wear when they know they've won the room, I walked out into a sky so blue it felt like a dare, went back to the hotel, scanned and sent every page with a subject line that didn't beg, then sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the city hum and to the dull new sound inside my chest. A door closing gently but completely, telling myself the truth has a longer half-life than charm, even if it loses every argument on the way to proof. The Fairmont rose like a frosted monument at the crest of Nob Hill. Strings warming up somewhere inside while town cars spilled satin and laughter onto the curb. And for one absurd heartbeat, I let myself picture a gentler version of this moment. Me straightening Eva's veil, whispering some small piece of mother wisdom I've been hoarding since Margaret died, until the doors parted and the air shifted, and there, on an ornate brass easel by the entrance, my own face stared back in dignified black and white above calligraphed words that kicked the ribs out of my chest. No entry. Giles Rice. By request of the bride and groom. I didn't drop the gift box because old men like me don't drop things in public. We place them down deliberately. So I set the Cartier necklace on the marble ledge beneath my printed smile, the ivory silk bow, bright as bone, and listened to the soft ripples of notice move through arriving guests. College friends who'd eaten birthday cake in my kitchen, my brother from Boston, neighbors who'd borrowed ladders and sugar, each glance bouncing off the sign like a pebble off glass. "Sir?" a security guard said gently at my elbow. Martinez on his badge and tired kindness in his eyes. "I'm sorry. I have instructions." And I could tell he had a daughter because he spoke like a man pulling a splinter, not a sword. "It's all right," I said, because anger would have been a smaller humiliation. "Could you call me a cab?" And he blinked, relieved, as if he'd braced for a scene and been handed a confession. Through the glass, I caught a glimpse of Harold directing a florist like a general moving troops, his tuxedo perfected to a fraction and his smile calibrated for photographs. And for the first time since the cafe, I felt something steadier than dread. Alignment, as if the world had finally stopped wobbling long enough for the truth to find its footing. The taxi rolled up in under a minute, and I climbed in without looking back. Gave the driver the Chase branch on Market and watched the city unspool. Cable cars shrugging down the rails. Tourists holding paper cups like trophies. My hands resting absolutely still on my knees, the way you hold them in a doctor's office when you've decided to hear the verdict. Inside the bank, the air was cool and unscented. The hour near closing, and the young associate, Jessica, didn't flinch when I said, "I need to stop payment on a check immediately." She just slid a form toward me and asked for the number. And I gave it to her calmly because revenge is loud, but consequences are quiet. And she tapped, printed, circled a confirmation code like a blessing. "This will take effect right away," she said. "Any attempt to negotiate that check will be declined." And I nodded, folded the receipt beside the creased graduation photo I keep in my wallet, and felt a hinge inside me catch in a new position. Somewhere uphill, candles were being lit and place cards squared, a string quartet finding Pachelbel's spine. And it comforted me to know that when the caterer asked for settlement and the Sumeyer ran Harold's dramatic card and the bandleader checked his contract, the answer would be the same cool beep the world gives to men who believe it owes them applause. Outside the branch, the light had gone, that California honey, long and lenient, and I walked a block without purpose, just to feel my feet agree with the ground, then hailed a cab back to my hotel and set the receipt on the desk like a photograph of a storm taken from a safe porch. I pictured the ballroom as a living organism, the hum of chatter thinning, the first murmurs rising when the florist quietly began reclaiming centerpieces, the musicians packing velvet-lined cases between movements, the caterer closing silver chafers with a practiced gentleness reserved for bad news. And I pictured Harold trying every script at once. Technical error, temporary hold, a bank manager's number that rings to no one. His eyes never quite meeting Eva's, because men like him cannot look at something they don't own. My phone stayed face down by the lamp. Its silence, the last gift I could give myself before the flood I knew was coming. And I sat in the dark a while with the window cracked so Nob Hill winter air could find me, hands folded in my lap, like a man at peace or a man in chapel. And I told Margaret what I'd done, not the petty part, the protective part, because love, at its best, is the stubborn architecture that remains when every decoration has been torn down. And if the price of keeping Eva alive to her own life was one ruined pageant, then let the fireworks fizzle and the cake go back to its bakery. I would answer when my daughter called, not with triumph, but with a chair and water and truth. And until then, I would do the hardest quiet thing. Wait. The first call came before the sun had finished laying itself across the window ledge. A chirp that I let slide into voicemail. Then a second, a third, and by the fifth, I turned the phone face up and watched the screen become a strobe. Harold Kensington, over and over, like a man pounding on a locked door he'd once walked through without knocking. I made coffee. I didn't taste, and sat in the armchair by the window, with the Chase stop payment receipt tucked like a talisman in my wallet, and let the messages stack into a narrative you could hear collapsing in real time. His opening tone smooth and managerial. Mr. Rice, small banking glitch, call me back. Shading to peevish command. Sir, this needs to be resolved now. Cracking into frantic bargaining under a wash of ballroom noise. Please, we can fix this. Just authorize the funds. And finally breaking into naked pleading as a violin listed somewhere behind him. Your daughter is crying. I am begging you. Between his calls, other numbers began to wedge themselves in. The caterer, per hour contract, immediate payment required. The band leader, we can't keep playing without settlement. The florist, already lifting centerpieces to protect inventory. Even my brother, texting from a corner of the chaos. Giles, something's wrong. People are whispering. And through it all, I pictured the choreography of unraveling. The Amex's flat refusal beep. The waiter who stops mid-pour. The photo booth shutter going dark. The string quartet setting bows in cases with the quiet shame that belongs to professionals forced to leave early. I didn't answer because sometimes the only way to let truth surface is to stop giving it your breath. And Harold's truth, when deprived of oxygen, showed its bones quickly. Message 37 was a ragged admission that he'd needed a bridge and intended to make you whole. Message 52 turned accusatory. My fault, my cruelty, my jealousy. And message 63 sounded like a man talking to himself in a mirror. The practiced charm gone, vowels flattened by panic. Then, on 68, a new voice cut in. Small and wet around the edges in the way that has undone me since she was a child. Dad, please. And the rest of Harold's noise dropped away as if someone had shut a door. I let 2 more calls ring, and then at 9:43, I answered and heard the low viola hum of a room after music has stopped, and Eva's whisper climbed through the static. He told me everything. And in the background, Harold Stage whispered a script about love and misunderstanding that no longer fit the scene. About the money, the other women, the frozen assets, I said, not to make her re-bleed it, but to knit our facts together. And she breathed yes, a sound like a match going out. I kept my own voice on the part of the road that isn't triumph or scolding, just lines and paint. I'll come, I will not pay, and I will not argue with anyone tonight. And she said, just be here. The way you say, please don't hang up, to a life raft. When we ended the call, I booked the red eye with hands that trembled only after the confirmation arrived, packed a suit and the Cartier box I'd retrieved from the hotel safe like a relic I couldn't decide to give or keep, and wrote a single sentence on the first page of Margaret's old journal. When the house caught fire, she called my name, not to be poetic, only to prove to myself that what had just happened belonged to the living. At the airport, I sat among couples in February coats and watched my phone flicker with the last futile volleys, vendors formal and clipped, a final bluster from Harold that collapsed mid-threat into a sob. Then I powered it down and stared through the glass at a runway glazed with sodium light until the world narrowed to the boarded plane. The thrum under my feet, and the small discipline of breathing evenly. Somewhere over Nebraska, with the cabin dim and the man beside me snoring softly, I let myself picture the moment I would step through whatever wreckage remained at the Fairmont. The wilted florals, the half-melted candles, my brother's worried face, and I rehearsed only the words that mattered. I'm here. You're safe. We're going home. By the time the pilot announced descent, the anger had drained out of me like weather, leaving a steadiness I recognized from other hard thresholds, hospital corridors, empty driveways, the first night after a funeral. And I understood that whatever came next would not be about winning or about punishment. It would be about lifting my daughter out of a room where a man had tried to turn love into a ledger and carrying her, with whatever remains of my strength, back into a life where truth isn't decorative, it's load-bearing. I landed just after dawn and rode up Nob Hill in a cab that smelled faintly of last night's perfume, the driver chatting about parades and parking as if the world hadn't tipped. The Fairmont's doors parted on a lobby still scented with spent roses and warm wax. And in that borderland hour, between cleanup and breakfast, I found the ballroom half undressed, linen heaped like drifted snow, a ladder leaning where the chandelier still glittered on schedule, a cart rattling with orphan champagne flutes, until a house manager with careful eyes pointed me toward a side corridor in the small sitting room where Eva waited. She was barefoot in a wrecked hem and cardigan someone had found, hair pinned back out of her face, eyes swollen but steady, and I kept my promise. No lectures, no postmortems, just crossed the room and said, I'm here, while she let all the air she'd been holding go. We sat on a love seat under a painting of ships in a calm harbor and did the next right things in order, because that's how you pull a life back from the cliff. Phone out, freeze every account, place fraud alerts, change the email passwords he'd guessed from anniversaries, call her bank's abuse line so a real person could flag the pattern before Harold tried one more withdrawal. And when the hotel's security chief appeared to say he'd been lingering by the elevators asking staff to send his wife down, I handed over my card and said any contact goes through me or the police. A knock came that wasn't staff, and for a second I smelled the cologne before I saw him. Suit jacket slung over one shoulder, smile soldered back into place. Mr. Rice, let's be reasonable. As if last night had been a misunderstanding about appetizers, And I rose but didn't move toward him, just kept my hands visible and my voice as flat as an invoice. We're done, Harold. You don't speak to her. You don't speak to me. Security will walk you out. And when he tried to pivot to Eva, sweetheart, they're lying to you. She didn't answer, didn't look up, just slid her phone across the table to the security chief with the text thread he'd sent another woman while she was getting her makeup done. The man who had spent 6 months arranging the world like a stage set misread the moment and reached for temper. But it wilted when two uniformed guards appeared at his shoulders, and the smile that had opened so many doors finally thudded shut. After he was gone, we gathered what mattered. Her small bag, the keepsake box she'd smuggled under her chair when the florist started reclaiming centerpieces, the Cartier necklace I placed in her palm and said, not as payment, not as apology, just a promise that you still get beautiful things. And we walked out through a service corridor that smelled of coffee and soap, past vendors who gave us the small nod reserved for people who have survived a night the city won't hear about. At her apartment, the quiet was a shock, a staged life suddenly refusing its own script. The tasteful couch, the blank space on the wall where the seating chart had hung, the bouquet scraps in the sink. And while she showered, I made a list on the back of a takeout menu. File police report, forward documents to the DA and to the agent whose card Gary had given me, collect vendor contracts, retrieve her grandmother's jewelry if it could be found, and taped it to the fridge because paper on a door is how you make a house feel like an ally again. We ate toast at her counter with the blinds half drawn against a morning too bright for how raw we felt. And she told me the parts I hadn't heard, the emergency authorizations he'd slid under her hand, the way he'd turned questions into proof of disloyalty, the photo he'd ordered of me with no entry, as though humiliation were a wedding favor. And when she faltered, I didn't fill the silence with hate, just refilled her mug and said, "We'll let the truth do the heavy lifting now." By noon, we were at the precinct with a folder so thick the detective stopped pretending not to be impressed. Chain of custody forms fluttering as he copied the burner phone texts and the Los Angeles filings I'd printed weeks earlier in a different bad hotel room. And when the detective asked whether she felt safe going home tonight, Eva looked at me and then at the list on her phone and said, with the locks changed and my father on the sofa, yes. Back at the apartment, I installed a new deadbolt with the old muscle memory of a man who fixes what he can reach. Sent a single text to my brother. She's safe. We're okay. And as evening drew its first line across the window, I pulled Margaret's photo from my bag and set it on the mantel. Eva stood beside me, hair damp, cardigan replaced by one of my old flannels she'd stolen years ago. And in the glass, I saw our three faces layered for a moment, the way I wanted them to be. And I heard myself say, the only plan we needed for the night. We rest. Tomorrow, we start making this official. Morning made good on our promise. We woke to a rectangular patch of San Francisco sun on the rug and a to-do list taped to the fridge, so we started at the top and moved like we were laying track. First, the courthouse for a temporary restraining order. Eva's hand steady as she signed while I slid the packet of screenshots, texts, and vendor contracts across to the clerk. Then the bank 2 blocks over, where a fraud specialist named Carla froze every card, placed hard alerts on her credit profile, and showed us how to lock down two-factor authentication in a way that made the apartment feel less porous. Detective Singh met us at the precinct with a paper cup of burnt coffee and an economy of words that read like respect. He'd already filed preservation requests for phone records, was drafting subpoenas to the payment processors, and wanted sworn statements from the florist and caterer about exactly when the groom's card declined turned into chaos. While Eva spoke, I watched the way she set each fact like a brick. No decoration, just a wall tall enough to keep the worst out. And when her voice thinned, he didn't push, just slid a tissue box over with the same quiet competence he'd used on the forms. By noon, we were back at her place gathering the physical breadcrumbs, the binder with vendor timelines, the envelope of receipts, the staging mock-ups Harold had printed to impress her. And my years in real estate, due diligence, finally felt like a gift instead of a hobby, as I built a timeline on her kitchen counter. Incorporation for Kensington Digital Ventures 6 months ago at a mailbox store. The lease on this apartment signed 2 weeks later. The engagement party photos time-stamped alongside transfers that bled her savings dry. When the federal agent Singh had looped in called Special Agent Maya Chu, voice calm and clipped. She asked for clean scans of everything and permission to image Eva's laptop. White collar's a slow river until it isn't, she said, and yesterday you dynamited a dam. The TRO was served by early afternoon. Martinez from the Fairmont texted to say a process server had found Harold at a co-working space on Market. The smile dropping off his face so fast the receptionist flinched. And 30 minutes after that, he violated it with a bouquet and a note pushed under the door. The kind of sloppy arrogance predators mistake for charm. We photographed everything without touching the paper, called Sing, and watched patrol officers bag the roses like evidence, while Eva's shoulders eased a fraction at the sound of official tape stretching. In the quiet that followed, we called the other women. Rebecca first, then Sarah, then a number we had for Jennifer that went to a new owner who still forwarded our message. And by dusk, 2 of them were on a video call, speaking to my daughter like she was a sister they hadn't known they'd meet, trading details so specific they braided into a pattern. The same frozen assets story, the same NDA he insisted on for investor privacy, the same pinky ring he twisted while asking for trust. I took notes while they spoke, and then stopped when I realized none of us needed proof as much as we needed permission to name what had happened without shame. At 6:12 p.m., Agent Chu called back to say the judge had granted a warrant for Harold's devices and cloud accounts, that their cyber team had already mapped 3 burner numbers to a lattice of shell LLCs, and that what we'd handed over plugged the last holes in a case that had been almost there for months. He'll try to triangulate you emotionally, she said, so don't take the bait. If he calls, don't answer. If he writes, don't reply. Let us collect it. Right on cue, his number flashed and vanished against the silence we gave it, followed by a voicemail. I didn't play, just saved and forwarded. We ate grocery store rotisserie chicken on paper towels at the counter while Margaret's photo leaned against the fruit bowl like a coach on the sidelines, and when Eva's fork stopped moving, she whispered, "I thought love meant never asking for receipts." And I answered, "Real love hands you every receipt before you ask," which made her laugh, the smallest laugh anyone ever earned. We taped a new list to the fridge. Tomorrow, sworn statements, locksmith for the building entry, meeting with Agent Chu, and set 2 mugs out for morning, as if ritual itself could sand down the day. And just as I was pulling the blanket over the sofa, Singh texted a single line that rang in my bones like a clean bell. "Warrant executed at 8 a.m. Be ready for a call." We were still buttering toast when the phone vibrated on the counter like it had a pulse of its own, and Singh's name lit the screen. "Search is live," he said, low and quick. "Co-working space and a storage locker in Dogpatch. Stay put. We'll update." So we stood in the square of morning sun and tried to act like people who could do anything useful with their hands, while somewhere across the city, doors opened under a judge's ink, and the life Harold had staged for us got peeled back to studs. At 8:23, Agent Chu called. No preamble, just inventory. 3 burners, 1 still warm. A laptop already syncing to a cloud drive their cyber team had mirrored. A leather portfolio with notarized investor NDAs that were copy-pasted templates. And in the locker, the kind of ugliness you can touch. Velvet ring boxes with identical stones, a folder of scanned signatures, a spiral notebook titled Run Book, where he'd written timelines like recipes: meet, dazzle, isolate, request, secure. Dates lining up with Eva's calendar in a way that made her grip the edge of the sink and breathe like she'd been running. "He's not here," Chu added, "but his car is, and the stairwell camera has him 5 minutes ago. Units are moving." And before Dredd could say its full sentence, Singh texted a photo of Harold in the gray hoodie I remembered from nights he'd played the generous host. Only now his hands were behind his back, and the caption was 3 words that landed like rain on a tin roof. Taken without incident. We didn't cheer. We washed our plates, put them on the rack, and sat very straight until Singh asked us to come in for property confirmations and formal statements. The precinct smelled like dry coffee and copier toner, and through the interview room's glass, we could see Harold at a table. That old toothpaste commercial face gone flat. Eyes scanning reflections for purchase. A public defender at his elbow. He tried to angle his wrist so we'd see the pinky ring, but the cuff caught the light instead. And when he finally saw Ava, he lifted his chin, not in apology, but in appraisal, the way a gambler watches a tell. We kept walking. Chu set the evidence out like sober altarpieces. USB sticks labeled seeds. A ledger of wallet addresses that linked to the transfers Rebecca and Sarah had described. The dummy LLC articles for Kensington Digital Ventures traced to the UPS box. Even a typed letter he'd drafted to Eva titled "Moving Past Misunderstandings," with blank spaces waiting for a date. "Paper shows pattern," Chu said, tapping the notebook. "Digits seal it." And then she slid a consent form across for imaging the iPad Harold had borrowed from Eva for wedding spreadsheets, which, when opened, greeted us with a hidden folder called Treasury. And my daughter, who used to hide birthday scavenger clues under couch cushions, nodded once and signed like a woman finished with hiding. By noon, we were in a holding area hallway for the bail hearing. Benches full of strangers whose crises rhymed with ours in ways you could feel but not name. The judge took the bench with the unshowy gravity of someone who has seen every kind of trouble twice. And when Harold's attorney said community ties and misunderstandings, Chu's affidavit answered with aliases, interstate victims, a violated TRO, devices seized, assets in motion. Bail was set high enough to measure in architecture, and a GPS anklet was ordered if posted. On the way out, Harold angled himself just right so the deputy couldn't block his mouth and said, "Mr. Rice, we can fix this." Not loud, not pleading, but like he was offering me a seat at a table he still believed he owned. I didn't answer because silence is armor, and also because Eva's fingers had found my sleeve and steadied there with a quiet I wanted to honor. Afternoon turned into paperwork and small mercies. The locksmith changing her building's front cylinder. Singh walking us through safety habits. Rebecca texting a photo of her own signed statement with a caption that said simply, "Together." And then, as we were leaving the precinct, a last complication. A process server found us on the sidewalk with a letter from Harold's lawyer, a settlement proposal dressed in legalese that boiled down to "hush your mouth and we'll make you whole." Eva laughed, a short, bright sound with an iron core, and handed it to Chu without breaking stride. Back at the apartment, the sun had slid to that late angle that makes even ordinary rooms look staged, and we wrote tomorrow's list on a fresh page. DA prep at 9, meeting with the victim's advocate at 11, call with the bank's recovery unit at 2, then ate leftover chicken cold and good, talking about everything but him until the talking ran out. When the phone finally buzzed again, it was Singh. One line like a promise. Grand jury Friday. Bring your timeline. And I looked at the leather journal Margaret had given me, at the neat block letters I'd forced my hand to write on the worst night of February, and felt something steady click back into place. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was record keeping, and records, kept with care, become the bridge other people walk to get out of the fire. The grand jury room was colder than it needed to be, the kind of institutional chill that keeps people awake. And when the clerk swore me in, I felt Margaret's leather journal like a second spine in my jacket pocket. Dates, amounts, names lined up in my neat block letters so the story could stand without my tremor. I told it clean. Let the documents do the cutting. And when they released us to the hallway with its hum of vending machines and bad coffee, Singh only nodded once. Enough. And by evening, the four-person signature had become an indictment that sounded like a door finally locking. The months after blurred into preparation and small, stubborn life. Eva changing the locks on her place, and then 2 weeks later, moving out entirely. A victims group chat that grew from 3 to 8 as Rebecca and Sarah and a woman from Seattle found one another. The Fairmont mailing back the Cartier box the concierge had quietly rescued the night of the collapse. Martinez had tucked a note inside. Thought this should be yours to decide. I kept it in the drawer by Margaret's photo while the DA played chess with calendars, and when the trial date loomed, Harold tried to turn the board with a plea. Wire fraud, identity theft, aggravated scheme to defraud, acceptance of facts without apology, a promise of restitution pinned to assets the government was already unspooling from shell companies and crypto wallets labeled seeds. On sentencing day, the courtroom was thick with summer and consequence. And when the judge asked if the defendant wished to speak, Harold stood, hands clasped, voice tuned to contrition, talking about volatility and misunderstandings, and love that got ahead of means, until the judge lifted one palm and set the room back on its rails. She read from the notebook Chu had called a run book, paused on the page where timelines matched Eva's calendar, quoted his own words: meet, dazzle, isolate, request, secure, and then spoke the only sentence that mattered: 16 to 20 years in federal custody, supervised release to follow. No contact orders. Restitution as the first line of his mourning for the rest of his working life. He flicked his eyes toward us, looking for the old purchase, and found none. We walked out into August glare that smelled like bus brakes and heat on stone. And for a long minute, neither of us said a thing, because sometimes victory is just the absence of threat. That night, I set the Cartier box on Eva's new kitchen island, a modest walk-up with plants in the window and a second-hand table that wobbled if you leaned too hard, and slid across a card in my crooked hand. For when beauty means only what you decide. She opened the silk. The diamonds caught the lamplight, and then she closed it carefully and pressed it back to me. Keep it for now, she said. Let it be a promise instead of a memory. We ate pasta we'd oversalted, argued good-naturedly about whether the thrift store chairs could be made to match, and afterward, she taped a photo to the apartment door, a candid of us at Coney Island years ago, sunscreen shiny and ridiculous, with a scrap of masking tape beneath where she'd written in blunt marker, entry, Dad. Weeks folded into a rhythm that didn't hurt. A Saturday of volunteering with Rebecca's nonprofit to teach basic fraud hygiene to college seniors. I talked about checkbooks and why old ways are just ways that worked. A Sunday of painting Eva's place the exact pale green Margaret loved. Afternoons where my phone buzzed with no emergencies, only recipes and plant advice, and a stray joke from Sing. Jury Duty, the sequel. And then one evening, as September leaned toward jacket weather, we hosted the people who'd stepped into our story for us. Rebecca with a pie. Sarah with a bouquet. She insisted was properly paid for. Martinez off duty and bashful in a collared shirt. Chu and Sing bringing 2 folding chairs and an ease that made the room feel finished. We raised mismatched glasses not to revenge, but to record keeping, to the long, boring miracle of paperwork that holds fast when charm tries to slip the knot. Later, when the dishes were stacked and the laughter had thinned to the soft talk of people who trust one another with quiet, Eva took the Cartier box from the drawer and set it on the table between us. Someday, she said, if I want to wear it, because I like how it looks. Not because someone told me it proves anything. And I thought of the easel at the Fairmont and the way humiliation had once guarded a doorway with my face upon it. The sign at our threshold now was just tape and ink and love. And as I turned out the kitchen light, I saw our reflection in the dark window. 2 people smaller than a city, brighter than a pane of glass, walking forward with nothing left to hide and everything left to choose.